Anyway, without further ado, Guy is here to do his talk on how much heat does our heat pump. So Guy is a physicist, I think, who works at Culham with Clive, one of our carbon cutters. And he's done lots of calculations and he's going to share with us what he's found out about having a heat pump installed. So I'll hand you over to Guy.
Okay, well, thank you very much for the introduction. As Caroline was saying, I am a physicist, but I've tried not to have too much physics in this, which I hope won't upset the physicists in the audience, but hopefully there'll be something for everybody. The reason for giving this talk was because a year ago, we decided to install a heat pump in our house, and I thought it would be good after a full year of operation to look at whether it was delivering what we expected or not. I think a lot of people are a bit nervous about such a major change, particularly when the cost is so high. Now, I did want on the front page to have a picture on the left side of the gas boiler in pristine condition in the house and the heat pump on the right. But looking through the photo albums, I didn't photograph our gas boiler on a regular basis. It seems to be children and cats and more interesting views. So there isn't a proper before and after picture. This particular image was taken, in fact, a day before lockdown happened, after our gas boiler had been removed and is sat in the garden. It is a Worcester Bosch 30 kilowatt, or was a Worcester Bosch 30 kilowatt condensing boiler that was about 10 years old, so might have needed replacing anyway in the next 5 years or thereabouts. But what this image quite well captures is just the totality of what you need to rip out and replace, more or less. Now, we were lucky that this little sort of extension on the back of our house had the gas boiler in it and also the hot water tank. Now, the hot water tank, if you switch to a heat pump, does need replacing. Even if it's a perfectly, seems like a perfectly good hot water tank, which ours was, and that's because the heat exchanging coil inside it is too short for the lower temperature water that comes out of a heat pump compared to a gas boiler. So that is something to bear in mind in that you will, if you go the same route as we did, you would have to have this tank replaced. Now, we replaced it with a Mitsubishi 11 kilowatt heat pump, which is sat there behind our house, and we're fortunate to have plenty of space for it. If we'd thought it was an eyesore, it is actually possible to move them further from the house and then have an insulated pipe that runs further if you are visually offended by it, but we're perfectly happy with it as it is. It's worth mentioning these powers, this 30 kilowatts says that is the amount of heat that the boiler is capable of delivering into our hot water and heating system. And whereas with the heat pump, it can deliver 11 kilowatts of heat. That's not the electricity it uses. That's the heat output. So obviously we hope that the electricity it uses is a lot less. Now that already tells you something already, that heat pumps tend to be much lower power output than typical gas boilers. Now, I've already said a fair amount, but I've better sort of get back to what I'm going to talk about. And the topics I'll be covering is how heat pumps work in general terms, why we chose an air source heat pump in our case, the process of changing, how scary is it? Does our system deliver the promised performance, which is obviously important? Capital cost and running costs, has it saved us any money? And some thoughts on the bigger picture, not necessarily totally in this order, however. Now, for those that are not really familiar with what a heat pump is, this is my schematic to explain it. The heat pump extracts heat from the outside air, which it sucks in. There's a large fan in the front of the heat pump which draws air in from the outside world and blows it out, and it passes through a heat exchanger. And in that heat exchanger, there's a volatile liquid, maybe a bit like alcohol, and it evaporates and carries, and that vapor is carried across into the white section, where it is compressed by a compressor and made to condense again. Now, as if you put alcohol gel on your hands or even water, your hand feels cold. And the reason it feels cold is because when liquids turn to vapor, they absorb heat from your hand. And so your hand really is getting colder, and the heat from your hand has gone into that vapor. And if you could capture that vapor and squeeze it and make it condense, you would recover that heat that you'd felt leave your hand would be recovered, and that liquid would be hotter than it would otherwise have been. And that's essentially how a heat pump works. It takes cold air in, which has still got heat in it, and it takes that heat, it raises it to a higher temperature, because you don't want air at zero in this case, outside air. It raises it to a higher temperature, and it delivers it to the water circuit in your house. So it feeds hot water to radiators or the hot water tank. And the important point about this is that the amount of electricity it takes to do this trick is less than the amount of heat that it actually delivers to your house. So effectively, it pumps heat from a cold place to a hotter place. Now, an essential point is that as with lifting a weight or pushing a weight up a hill, the further you have to lift that weight, the more effort it takes. And in the same way, the bigger the temperature difference between the outside, where the air's cold, and the inside your house, the bigger that difference, the more energy is required to pump that heat in that way. And the remarkable thing is that you can actually get a lot more heat out than the amount of effort that you put into the compressor in this rather clever machine. Now, this gain that you get, this is captured in a number, which this is the most physicsy bit of the talk you might be pleased to hear. The heat pump has something called a coefficient of performance, and that basically tells you how much heat is delivered for the amount of electricity consumed. The bigger that number, the better. It's the sort of buy one, get several free sort of deal. It's what you want. And the other number that you see in a lot of the documentation to do with heat pumps is the seasonal performance factor, which is basically this coefficient of performance, but it's averaged over all seasons of the year. So it's an annual average, because as I've said, the efficiency of a heat pump depends on how big a temperature difference it's trying to pump the heat between. And during the year, sometimes it's hotter outside and sometimes it's colder. Now, this story is sort of captured. This is the most physicsy graph. It is the theoretical best performance curves for a heat pump. And it's based on work that was done in the 19th century. So it's not new physics. People were trying to understand the efficiency of steam engines, and they were very confused by what heat was really. And so it's not surprising if people find the idea of heat pumps difficult to understand even today. But what this graph shows is this coefficient of performance on the left-hand side, the y-axis of the graph, against the temperature along the bottom, which we're trying to pump the heat from. So in the case of our air source heat pump, this is the outside air temperature. And that varies, of course. In winter, it might get down to 0, around freezing or whatever, and summer it'll be up the right end of this scale. Now, I've put in, to start with, if we consider what happens with a normal electric heater, a normal, like a fan heater, for example, that always has a coefficient of performance of 1, because the amount of electricity that goes in is the amount of heat that comes out. It's all contained in the room that you're in. It's 1. If I have a gas boiler, the coefficient of performance is less than 1, because we have to have a chimney, and some of the heat is always lost up the chimney. So a condensing boiler, it can be 0.9 or something like that. It can be pretty high. A wood fire or something would be even less in terms of the fraction of heat that stays in the room and how much goes up the chimney. Now, if you have a ground source heat pump, the big advantage is, whereas the air temperature over the year varies a lot, with a ground source heat pump, the you pump heat from the ground rather than the air, with a loop of pipe that runs around your garden, for example. This ground temperature doesn't vary much. And if we look at these theoretical curves, what they tell us is, if we had an absolutely perfect heat pump and we were trying to pump heat from the ground at 10 degrees and deliver hot water at 55 degrees, which is typically what you need for a modern hot water system, then I would be getting, if we look at the left-hand scale here, about 7 times as much heat out than electricity in, which is, of course, pretty amazing, but it's a theoretical limit. It's not what you can actually do. The upper graph shows, well, if I'm not heating water, if I'm just sending, want radiators to heat radiators, then I don't need the radiators if they're big enough. I don't need them to be at 55 degrees, so I can have them at 35. And in this case, I can get a coefficient of performance that's nearer 12. In reality, real heat pumps are 1/2 to 1/4 of these theoretical values, so down around 3 to 4. But just as these curves sort of get lower towards the left, as the heat, as the temperature where you're drawing the heat from gets lower, the efficiency of real heat pumps gets worse, you know, if they're air source heat pumps when the weather's colder. But fortunately for us in the UK, the average winter temperature, I mean, I have measured it for the last few years. I could show a graph of it at the end if anyone's interested. Averaged over the winter seasons between October and April, it's always between about 5 and 7. So the temperature is not so different from the average ground temperature. So the benefit of a ground source heat pump is relatively modest on average compared to a ground source heat pump. So now I've spent a bit of time on this, but because it's worth understanding that the efficiency of these things depends on temperature. But as I said, I mean, real heat pumps aren't perfect by any means, and there are lots of things that degrade efficiency. There's the friction in the bearings that you're having to blow air through because they cool the air, and you can see the heat exchanger here on the left. As it cools the air, water condenses, and then if the weather's cold enough, that water freezes and ice builds up. And periodically, the heat pump has to defrost itself by putting heat in. Of course, not what you want, really. You don't want to have your heat, you know, going into melting ice in your heat pump, but it has to do this, or it can't suck any more air. So that's one thing that degrades the efficiency. And there are lots of things like this that make it less than perfect. One thing, if anyone's thinking of installing one of these things that we didn't think about, was it was fairly easy to fix in our case, but because of this defrosting process and condensation, you can get a big puddle. So you need to think about drainage of this condensate around an air source heat pump. Okay, well, what sort of house have we got? Well, it's a 1954 three-bedroom detached bungalow. We've done all the obvious things: loft insulation, cavity wall insulation, double glazing. We have a full photovoltaic system. I'm not going to show that, but there's a slide at the end if anyone's interested in the numbers. We have underfloor heating in about half of it, an area at the back, and we've got radiators elsewhere. So it's a sort of mix of stuff. Now, one point to make here is that here we've got 15mm copper pipe. If you have that, radiators can be used with a heat pump. If you have microbore tubing, which is very noticeably thinner than this, then without replacing all your plumbing and radiators, it won't be suitable, because the heat pump is always trying to deliver water at the lowest possible temperature to achieve the heating that you need. The reason being that the efficiency of the heat pump's always higher the less it has to raise the temperature compared to the outside. So it's always trying to give you as cold as possible water to your radiators, and to keep the flow up, you need larger tubes. Now, heat pumps, installing heat pumps, it's only even economically sensible at all at the moment because of the renewable heat incentive. And this is a government organized scheme run by Ofgem, and it funds various things, not just air source heat pumps. It does ground source heat pumps, solar thermal, and biomass. And but for the domestic RHI for heat pumps, which is all I know about because we haven't applied for any of the others, it's paid quarterly over 7 years. It's a grant, but you have to pay the money up front and then you get it back over 7 years. It's linked to inflation rate, RPI, which is quite attractive, which makes it worth more than it would have been given low interest rates at the moment. The payments are based on, if you're a domestic system, the payments are based on your energy performance certificate for your house, and you have to have an up-to-date one to apply for this, which has been done in the last 2 years. You are paid on the basis of the amount of heat this EPC says you use, not any metered quantity. If you're a commercial installation, you need a heat meter. And at least, I don't know what the rules are, but you can need a heat meter at least. Now, systems that qualify for this grant must be MCS compliant. That's this microgeneration registration scheme, and it can be applied retrospectively. Now, the website is very good for the RHI, and I've snipped a bit out. It's got its own calculator, so you could see what it would do for you. It's got good, clear guides. It lists the sort of equipment you can install, and it's even got a list of approved installers. Obviously, to qualify for the scheme, you've got to go through all the approved suppliers for that to apply. They're not going to pay you for something you've built yourself on and installed yourself on your house, unfortunately. The scheme was due to end this April, but is now extended to April 2022. So we haven't missed the boat. In April 2022, something new's coming in and the details aren't yet available. The only obligation seems to be you have to make an annual declaration, and it just very quick. You just have to say you occupied your house, in other words, it wasn't vacant, you've maintained the equipment according to the manufacturer's instructions, etc. Pretty boring. I was going to say that from the payment that the Green Home grants deducted, but since that scheme, I wrote that, the scheme collapsed because it was so apparently bureaucratic and not working that it's essentially gone, as far as I know. So, estimates for our house. Well, I should say that the company we used was Alto Energy, and the reason for that was that our plumber had installed a heat pump for himself and his parents, who live practically next door to us, just a bit down the road. His was an air source, his parents was a ground source, and he had sourced these heat pumps through Alto Energy. So I had him do the job, and we sourced the heat pumps through Alto Energy. And the first thing they did when we contacted them was to do some estimates, and they estimated that we would need an 11 kilowatt Mitsubishi EcoDan system, or they recommended it. They did say a slightly smaller one might be just big enough, but and it would have been a bit cheaper, but to be safe, go for the bigger one. Its estimated seasonal performance factor was 3.11, which should mean that we get over 3 times as much heat out as electricity in. Our system cost £11,500, and the estimated RHI payments should be 9,900 over 7 years. That's without any RPI factor applied. That's just, yeah. So I didn't at the time ask for a ground source heat pump quote for comparison, but I did when I was preparing this talk, because we decided against ground source for reasons I'll come on to. So they've just given me an equivalent estimate using all the details of our house, everything the same. And the estimated SPF for this system is 3.07, which interestingly isn't any higher than the air source heat pump. And that led me to ask Alto Energy, well, why is anybody actually bothering with ground source heat pumps, given that if you have a shallow system, which is 1.2 meters deep and 400 meters long, that's a lot of trench you need to dig somewhere. The cost then will be £20,000 at the end of the day, probably. These are estimates. It depends on details, of course. And if you have vertical boreholes, which take less space, then you have big machinery. They cost £27,000 or thereabouts. Well, the reason people still go with these systems is because the RHI payments are about £19,000 over 7 years. So the payment you get for heat from ground source is almost double what you get from air source. This is because they wanted to encourage the technology, I suppose. And in theory, it should be better. But according to Alto Energy, the investments have been higher in air source technology. So its SPF is better than perhaps theoretically you might expect compared to ground source. Anyway, the reason we didn't choose a ground source heat pump is clear from this picture. We have a very nice mature garden, which is only just big enough to accommodate a ground loop, and it would have meant total destruction. So on that basis, we didn't really think any further. We didn't want to dig our whole garden up, so that was that. Okay, so the steps in the project were to get an initial estimate of the performance and cost from Alto Energy, an up-to-date EPC from the EPC assessor. That you have to comply in order to get the RHI, you have to comply with the basic recommendations on insulation and such. But fortunately, you don't have to comply with the rather balmy and out of date recommendations. Like in our case, they recommended a micro wind turbine as a possible improvement, which makes no sense given we have a whole beautiful row of tall plane trees right opposite our house, which weren't factored into this advice. So anyway, so we then paid for a deposit for the survey and design to Alto Energy. And this, what they do is assess radiator sizes for RHI compliance. And that was a source of anxiety, because you have this vision of needing to change all your radiators because they're all too small, because the water's at a lower temperature than from gas. But fortunately, most gas systems, according to Alto Energy, they rarely need to change more than 1 or 2 radiators to be compliant in people's houses, because they tend to be naturally oversized anyway, because people are conservative and tend to just make things too much bigger than they need to because they can. So it's not usually a problem. But you could stop at that stage if you didn't like the conclusion. So they also have to check your electricity supply is sufficient with the network. And then we placed the order. The heat pump installation took 4 days of a plumber plus electrician. And as I said, they had to replace the hot water cylinder and 1 radiator. And those things had to be done in order to qualify for the RHI. You have to have a compliant system. The commissioning took 1 day, and that was Alto Energy. Alto Energy provided this certificate, and we registered the system with Ofgem. That was easy, smooth, no problem. Now here's the real crunch of my talk. Really, how did the system perform? Now, what this bar chart shows is our annual energy use of gas and electricity compared to what happened after we installed the air source heat pump. Now, the data for this graph comes just from ordinary meter readings. We don't have smart meters. I just photograph the meters periodically with a smartphone, and on the left is the gas meter, and on the right is the air source heat pump, has its own electricity meter. So if we look at the graph, what it's got on the y-axis is the number of kilowatt hours we use per year. Now, of course, gas is in cubic meters, but if you go to the Ofgem site, it tells you a number that you can use to convert gas into cubic meters into kilowatt hours, and most energy suppliers will do that for you anyway in your consumption figures. And so we've been taking data since 2011, and these are stacked bars, and the bottom bit of the bar is the electricity we're using, and the red bit at the top is the gas. And you can see it sort of goes up and down a bit, our gas consumption over the years. And this, I could show a graph at the end. It seems pretty clear that most of this is to do with variations in the average winter temperature from year to year. Now, when we went to, after installing the heat pump, of course, you can see our energy consumption has gone down quite a bit. Of course, our background electricity consumption hasn't changed, and there's no reason it should. But the green bar compared with the red bar is actually about 2.6 times less. So that already tells you that we didn't quite get this 3.1 in terms of performance, but there's a bit more to the story, which I'll come on to. So this little red bit here is worth a mention, and that is to say we didn't get rid of our gas hob right away, thinking about that. But so at least it tells us how much was being used by just the gas hob over the years, probably. Now, what does this mean in terms of this performance factor, which in some ways reflects the title of the talk? Well, now in commercial systems, they fit heat meters. So you know how much heat how much heat comes out of your heat pump compared to how much electricity goes in. So it's trivial to calculate the performance in theory. However, we don't have heat meters, we're not required to. So the only thing I can do is assume that we used as much heat in 2019 when we were on gas as we did in 2020 with our heat pump. On that basis, in 2019, we used 14,114 kilowatt hours of heat. And that's on an assumption that our gas boiler had an efficiency of 94%. In other words, it's some of the heat is 6% of our gas energy has gone up the chimney. That's basically what that says. But in 2020, our heat pump used 5,922 kilowatt hours of electricity. That means the performance factor would be 2.39. And as I've said, our original SPF based on the this MCS, the official data, was 3.1. So something's not quite the same. If this number were true, then it would say that in 2020, our heat use had gone up to 18,400 kilowatt hours of heat. Now, I just mentioned that the EPC predicted 19,478 kilowatt hours of heat. So which is right? Well, actually, it's a bit hard to say for sure. And it's probably true that our heat use in 2020 was greater than 2019. There are many reasons for that. One is that we were at home more due to the pandemic and retirement. My wife retired, and so there was probably more time spent in more rooms of the house, so we were happier to have more rooms warm, so that may have contributed. But I think an important factor, which you shouldn't underestimate, is that because heat pumps are always trying to optimize their efficiency by delivering the lowest temperature water to you they can, and they do this. I mean, our air source heat pump knows the air temperature outside, and it's always saying, "Oh, yeah, it's not so cold today. I'll turn down the thermostat a bit and send them slightly cooler water because it'll still keep the house at the right temperature." So it's always playing that game. But what that means is you can't go out for the day, turn the heating off, and when you come back, switch it on and expect the house to warm up suddenly, because it won't. You'll get tepid water and it'll be many hours later before the house will be warm again. So it's much better to keep your house running at a more constant temperature with a heat pump. So this sporadic use of gas boilers makes them a bit more efficient. So you're never comparing like with like. Of course, it may also be true that the official SPF predicted is over optimistic. After all, you know, car emissions or car MPGs often seem a bit over optimistic to owners. So yeah, it's possible that that's the case. Although Alto Energy do claim, though they haven't sent me the numbers, that where they've had heat meters that there's reasonable agreement, they said, but I don't know how reasonable is. Mitsubishi, I just a week before this, I got an email from them saying they found a software problem with our heat pump, and the compressor was potentially running erratically, and this might affect performance. They didn't say how much, so perhaps we've just got a slight software bug. Or maybe it's some of all the above. Now, one thing that perhaps helps understand a bit more what the performance is like is the data on this slide. And what I've plotted here now is the energy consumption, this time on a daily basis. This is kilowatt hours per day. And it's all the data points I have. So each point might represent a week, a month, whenever I took the reading, basically. And it's plotted versus outside temperature. Now, my neighbor has kindly got a weather station that records the temperature. So I've used that data and I've averaged that outside temperature over the same time interval as my measurements of heat use. And if we just look at the heat pump electricity use, because this is nicely behaved, what you see is that as the temperature decreases, of course, we use more and more, our heat pump draws more and more electricity as the house needs more and more heat to keep warm. That's exactly what you'd expect. And you'd also expect it to be pretty linear, so that pretty proportional. So it really does form quite a nice straight line here. Now, when you look at the gas, you can already see that it's a lot more scattered. And I think this shows that the sporadic use of the gas boiler, probably the upper points on this graph are periods when, for whatever reason, we wanted to heat our house more uniformly at a more constant temperature for that period of time. And as a result, if you really wanted to know the performance of our system, it might be better to compare the points that are near the top end of the gas curve with those that are near the top end of the heat pump. And if you do that, you do get a performance factor that is more, if you take the average winter temperature here of around 6 or 7, the performance factor you get is about the 3.1 or thereabouts that is was promised originally. But of course, that's not what you pay for. You pay for the average. So yeah, technically it might be correct, but the reality may be different. Now, this graph also shows us the answer to another question that I was asked, actually, which I thought was a useful question, which is, can our heat pump cope with the cold? Well, the lowest temperature I managed to get data points for, which is probably single days, is down to about -1, which you can see here outside, which is getting pretty cold. And you can see from the sort of average of the gas data that we're still getting at least twice as much heat out as electricity in. So it's not like it falls off a cliff at low temperature. It gets a bit worse, but it's not a disaster. And of course, the average temperature is what matters, not the coldest days. And certainly we didn't have a problem staying warm enough on the coldest days. It still had enough heat output. So what are the economics? Well, the total project cost, I've said, was about £11,500. The RHI payment over 7 years, 9,900, excluding RPI indexation. So, it doesn't fully cover the capital cost, but it's pretty close. And if you account for the fact that our boiler would have needed replacing in the next 5 years, which it doesn't now, the heat pump should last up to 20 years, they say, you can see that capital cost wise, it's neutral. The annual running costs are really the issue. And what I've calculated here is equivalent costs based on current energy prices. This isn't what we paid. I've took the units we used and say, okay, if I bought this today at the same point in the market, what would the relative cost be? And that says that comparing 2019 and 2020, our energy cost, heating cost, went up by 82%. Our total energy cost, however, only went up by 47%, because of course electricity is relatively expensive, and while it was only a small fraction of what we were using before, it still was half the cost. So you know, that's something to bear in mind. But is this a fair comparison? Well, you should decide. But I mean, we probably were using more heat in 2020, so this is probably a bit pessimistic, but I can't say how much. The bottom line is that gas is way too cheap. It's about 5 times cheaper than electricity. And that means unless your performance factor is 5 or above, it will cost you more to run. And no heat pump will do that. The servicing costs are similar or greater than a gas boiler. I don't see why, really. They're simpler. They ought to be cheaper, but I think because it's a specialized thing providing heat pumps, in reality, they aren't cheaper to service. Now, what about the bigger picture? Switching from mains gas, the economics clearly need improving. I mean, we are lucky enough to have had the capital for this. The RHI scheme is good, but you have to finance it, get the initial upfront sum from somewhere. And the scheme is to be replaced next April, and Alto Energy think that it'll be a similar, in some respects, grant, but that there won't be a premium for ground source heat pumps. So if you want one, get one now, I think is the answer. The current energy running costs are way too high. Mains gas is too cheap. But of course, if you have oil or LPG run boilers, these fuels are much more expensive, and you will make a saving on running costs probably if you're on these other fuels, but you can get a quote from the company. Heat pumps can eliminate direct carbon emissions. I mean, that's why we did it in the first place. And they do make the best use of any energy source. I cannot understand why the government is interested in hydrogen for heating, because it's so much less energy efficient, given that the coefficient of performance of a hydrogen boiler has to be less than 1, because some of the heat will go up the chimney. And if you generated the hydrogen from renewable electricity, then you'd be much better off putting that electricity into a heat pump. You get, you know, up to 3 times as much heat out. So it's a bit hard to understand, other than that it's a bit of a lifeline maybe they're throwing to the fossil fuel industry, so it can basically convert methane into hydrogen and stay in business that way and bury the carbon somehow. So it's worth mentioning that combined heat and power is also less efficient than heat pumps. There's a section in David McKay's book, Renewable Hot Energy, Sustainable Energy Without the Hot Air. And air source heat pumps, I think, are very much the way forward, mainly because they're installable on the largest number of dwellings in the UK, and because we're blessed with a relatively warm winter, the performance is really very comparable to ground source heat pumps. Now, it's worth mentioning that, you know, I mean, some people have combi boilers, and you could still work within the RHI scheme if you had your water heated differently from the main heating. So you could just get the RHI payment for heating and say have electric heating for the hot water, just conventional electric heating. That would be allowed within the scheme, such as spontaneous showers or whatever. There's clearly still some room for heat pump performance to improve compared with theory. So I think there's a good future for these things. So in summary, how much heat pump did our heat pump pump? Well, the answer is we don't know, because the heat output isn't measured. But we know it was at least 2.6 times lower. Our energy use was at least 2.6 times lower than with gas, which is a good thing of itself. And the real performance is probably better. But I think a key lesson is that the heat required may go up just due to changed pattern of use. So you should factor that in if you're thinking of going ahead. Our system works well, and the RHI scheme is simple to use. And of course, the important bottom line is that our CO2 emissions have been reduced by 3 tons per year. But in general, for other people to take it up who can't absorb the costs, the higher incentives are required if this is to move forward. Gas is far too cheap. And of course, as demand falls, if heat pumps really do get a lot more popular, the price of gas will fall, and that will make it even harder to persuade people to switch. So that's all. Thank you.